year we enter into the season of Lent with Jesus entering into the wilderness. In our Lenten Bible study for this year, the author James Harnish writes the following. He says, "The wilderness represents more than a lonely, barren place on the map. It's a place where God's people confront the ruthless power of temptation. It's the place where they wrestle with questions about who they are, where they are going, and how they are going to get there." In our first reading this morning from the book of Deuteronomy, we reflected back to the wilderness experience of Israel. After Moses led the Hebrew people out of Egypt, God led them into the wilderness, and they were there for 40 years in a state of wandering. And in that desert space, the Israelites wrestled with their collective identity. What does it mean to be the people of God? They wrestled with where they were going and where they would be placed in the world. Where is the promised land anyway, right? And how are we going to get there? And as Harnish says, the children of Israel were definitely confronted there in the wilderness with the ruthless power of temptation. Who can forget the infamous calf debacle? The Israelites grew very impatient with the Lord. So they asked Aaron, the brother of Moses, if he would make them a different God, a God who could lead them, a God who wouldn't keep them waiting, a God who would take them where they needed to go. And Aaron was very quick to oblige the request of his people. He gathered up all of their gold, and as he told Moses, he just put that precious metal into a fire, and out popped the golden calf. That golden calf that very quickly became an object of worship for Israel, and throughout their history, they kept confronting that same temptation. See, the wilderness is the place where God's people confront the ruthless power of temptation. It's where they wrestle with who they are, where they are going, and how they are going to get there. Our gospel reading this morning reports that Jesus also faced that same ruthless power of temptation that Israel faced. After he was baptized, the Spirit led him out into the wilderness, and he spent the next 40 days in a state of deep contemplation. He was confronted there in the desert with questions about his identity and where he was going, what would be his place in the world. What does it mean to be the Christ of God? And how is the Christ to live out his role? So we heard Glinda read for us that Jesus answered those questions for himself when he was tested by the devil. By the devil. A couple of weeks ago, my son Sam took me to the Albuquerque Museum. Completely different swap of roles, right? Usually the mom takes the kid to the museum, but this time it was the other way around. Sam took me to the Albuquerque Museum, and we spent, I don't know, at least 3 hours just touring that facility and looking at all the beautiful exhibits. And among the many pieces, there were 2 extraordinary works that just totally captivated my my theological interest. One of them was this huge painting, and the other was a truly gorgeous wooden sculpture. Both of them depicted the same scene, and the scene was that in which Michael the archangel is spearing Satan in a triumphant blow. Kind of a loose interpretation of Revelation chapter 12. I think it's verses 7 through 12. The thing that struck me the very most about these two different pieces of art was how very differently the artists had rendered the Satan. In the painting, the devil was a man. He had lovely curly ringlets, I'll tell you. And he had wings that were much smaller than St. Michael's. And unlike Michael's that were full of feathers, the Satan's wings, well, they looked like kind of this dark, rubbery flesh. I don't really know how else to explain it. And they came up on the top to a very distinctive point. If it weren't for those wings, this particular devil would have looked like any other male person with lovely dark ringlets on his head. The Satan in the wooden carving was very, very different. His entire body was this deep, rich, dark, bright red. He had a tail with a little point on the end of it. He had pointy little horns. He had a bald head, a horrible face, and a dark black goatee on the tip of his pointy little chin. I was captivated by the fact that these two artists had captured such very different characteristics of the same spiritual being. My son and I stood back and just took it all in for a very long time, comparing this devil with that devil. It reminded me that the devil, the Satan, the accuser, is actually many things to many people. Mostly this vehicle of accusation and temptation is the inner voice within us all. It's that egocentric or that self-centered aspect of every single human being that calls us away from God's holy presence. We're lured away by a desire, even a lust, to put ourselves at the center of everything. And that was the temptation with which the devil confronted Jesus. Will you be at the center of everything? We meet the tempter much like he did out in the wilderness and in the desert places of our spiritual growth, those places where we're confronted with our fears and our anxieties, with our inadequacies, with our failings, and with our very great need. But the truth is that as we wrestle with those temptations that we face day in and day out, we discover who we are, right? We discover where we're going and how we are going to get there. Israel's temptation is the very same temptation that is faced by every nation of the world. The enticement to worship a national god of power and of polity, of wealth and of war. And sadly, it seems like every nation falls victim to their own inner voice. Remember, it was only as the Hebrew people surrendered to Yahweh, the Holy God, that they were finally able to enter the Promised Land. So the Lord rescued them from self-annihilation. We heard that in the book of Deuteronomy this morning. God liberated them from themselves and brought them to a place that was ripe with all kinds of blessing. We heard in Deuteronomy 26, the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and gave us this land. Because you see, God saves. God saves. Well, just as Israel's temptation in the Old Testament reflects every nation's struggle, the temptation of Jesus in the New Testament is a very real depiction of the struggle of every individual. When he faced the devil, he faced a pivotal moment in his life and in his ministry, and I would say perhaps the most pivotal moment in his identity. Because it was at that point that he answered for himself, will God's Christ seek power and wealth and prestige? Will he use his spiritual authority and his spiritual wisdom to gain worldly luxury and worldly honor? Or will the Christ humble himself, even die himself in order to reveal the life-saving love of God? Of course, we're good churchgoers, and most of us grew up in Sunday school, and so we know, right, how the answers to the questions play out in Jesus' life. But how do they play out in our own lives? The wilderness represents more than a lonely, barren place on the map. It's the place where God's people confront the ruthless power of temptation. It's where they wrestle with questions about who they are and where they are going and how they are going to get there. God led Israel out into the wilderness. The Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. And God leads us through the wilderness of Lent. This holy season asks us, first and foremost, how we are going to identify ourselves in relationship to God. It asks where we are going, where we hope to find ourselves in the world, and how we're going to get there. But here in this desert place, between death and life, in this space between where we've been and where we are going, we recognize our vulnerability against the ruthless power of temptation. And yet, the good news is that there is one who can rescue us from self-annihilation. When we deny our ego's request, those tests of the devil, to make ourselves the center of the universe, it is then that we find the one who liberates us from ourselves. The one whose power is reflected in the very name of Jesus, which means God saves. God saves. The journey through the 40 days of Lent reminds us that just like Israel before us, and just like Jesus the Christ, we are in utter need of the God who saves. The God who saves us in the wilderness. The God who saves us from temptation. The God who saves us for eternal life. In the name of the God who saves, then, amen. Will you join with me now in the prayer for Lent? This will be our response to the word. It's found